She waited 7 days in a wedding dress no one came to claim, until a small voice asked a question that would change 3 lives forever. Lydia Hawthorne sat on the narrow wooden bench at Briar Creek Station with her gloved hands folded in her lap, and her wedding dress gathered tight around her knees, as if holding the fabric together might keep the rest of her from unraveling. And every hour that passed felt heavier than the last, because she was no longer waiting for a train. She was waiting for proof that she had not destroyed her life by believing a stranger's promise. The wind blew grit across the platform and into the lace, dulling the white to a tired gray, and she brushed it away again and again, even though it never stayed clean for long. Because 7 days earlier she had stepped off the eastbound train with a letter pressed to her chest and hope stitched into every breath. A letter that had promised marriage, a modest house, steady work, and a future that did not require apologies. Signed in a careful hand by a man who called himself Robert Miles and wrote as if he already loved her. And on the first day she told herself he was delayed. On the second she told herself the trains ran slow out here. On the third she told herself love required patience. But by the 4th day the station clerk had stopped meeting her eyes, and by the 5th day the townsfolk had begun to whisper. And on the 6th day Lydia learned the truth when the telegraph operator finally cleared his throat and told her there was no Robert Miles registered anywhere in the county. No claim filed under that name. No record at all. Just another marriage swindle whispered about in frontier towns where lonely women arrived with dresses and dreams and left with neither. The words landed inside her like a stone dropped into water and never sank. And when the clerk gently suggested she take the westbound train back where she came from, Lydia lifted her chin and said she would not be leaving, because leaving meant returning to a life where everyone already expected her to fail, and staying meant she could still pretend this disaster was temporary. That dignity was something you could keep if you stayed perfectly still. The station master offered her a coin for food on the 2nd night, and she refused it, then accepted bread from a passing woman on the 4th, then stopped refusing anything at all, because hunger made decisions for you whether you wanted it to or not. And by the 7th day Lydia had learned the shape of waiting so well that her body barely noticed the hours anymore. Only the looks, the way people slowed when they passed, the way pity turned to annoyance, the way the bench felt harder each night and the sky felt too wide to care. She told herself she was invisible, that no one truly saw her. And then small boots stopped in front of her, and a shadow cut across the dust, and Lydia looked up to see a boy standing there, maybe 8 years old, thin and sun-browned, wearing trousers too short for his legs and boots too big for his feet, as if he had grown faster than his life could keep up with him. And he stared at her without fear or judgment, only curiosity sharpened by something older than his years. And after a moment he said, "You're the bride who's been waiting." Not as a question, but as a statement. And Lydia felt her throat tighten because hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way her thoughts never had. She told him quietly that she was nobody's bride, but the boy tilted his head the way children do when they know an answer adults refuse to accept, and said he had seen her sitting there every day, that his father said waiting that long took strength, and before Lydia could stop herself she asked where his father was, and the boy said, "Working," like it explained everything, then added, "That's why I came to find you." And Lydia almost smiled at the absurdity of it until he reached out and touched the edge of her dress with careful fingers, as if it were something important, and asked in a clear, steady voice, "Will you marry my daddy?" The world seemed to pause. At the sound of it, the wind, the station, the distant call of a conductor, and Lydia stared at him, certain she had misunderstood, but his face held no mischief, only earnest hope. And she told him gently that marriage was not something you could ask a stranger to do. And the boy shrugged and said strangers were just people you had not known long enough yet, then explained with the plain logic of a child that she needed somewhere to go, his father needed help, and he needed someone who stayed. And the simplicity of it struck Lydia harder than the clerk's truth ever had, because it offered no lies, no promises dressed in pretty words, just need laid bare. She asked his name, and he told her it was Thomas Reed, and his father's name was Daniel Reed. And he spoke quickly now, as if afraid she might disappear, listing his father's faults the way one offers evidence in court. He burned food, forgot things, worked too much, talked too little, but followed each flaw with proof of goodness. proof that he did not drink or shout or scare him the way other men did. And Lydia listened with her heart hammering because no one had spoken to her this honestly in weeks. And when Thomas pulled a crust of bread from his pocket and offered it to her, she took it without thinking, her hands shaking as she ate because hunger and relief crashed together inside her. And when he picked up her carpet bag and started dragging it away with stubborn determination, Lydia heard herself asking how far his home was before she could remind herself she had no intention of following him. And when he said 3 miles north and smiled like sunrise, something inside her shifted, not into certainty, but into motion. And Lydia stood, legs aching from days of stillness, and looked once more down the tracks toward the east, where shame waited neatly wrapped in familiarity. Then down the road where a child in oversized boots carried her bag as if it already belonged with him. And she realized that staying on that bench was no longer strength, but surrender. And so she stepped off the platform and followed Thomas Reed into the open land, not knowing whether she was walking toward trouble or rescue, only knowing that for the first time in 7 days she was no longer waiting. Lydia followed Thomas Reed along the dirt road as the town thinned behind them, her dress gathered in one hand, her carpet bag swinging awkwardly from the other, and every step felt like crossing a line she had not meant to draw, because she was no longer a woman waiting to be chosen, but a woman choosing movement over stillness, even if she did not yet know where it would end. Thomas walked with purpose, his oversized boots thudding against the ground as if the land itself recognized his claim to it. And he talked as they went, filling the space with details about his father's habits, the way he woke before dawn and came home after dark, the way he sat quiet at the table like he was listening for someone who never spoke anymore. And Lydia listened with the careful attention of someone who had learned that small truths often mattered more than grand promises. The house came into view low against the open land, built of weathered boards and stubborn effort, smoke curling thin from the chimney. And Lydia felt a strange mix of relief and fear at the sight of it, because it was real, undeniably so, and reality had not been kind to her lately. Thomas slowed at the steps for the first time, his confidence wavering just enough to show he understood the weight of what he had done. "Pa don't like surprises," he said quietly. Lydia knelt so they were eye to eye and told him she did not want to cause trouble, but Thomas shook his head and said, "You're not trouble. You're a maybe." And before she could ask what that meant, he pushed the door open and called his father's name with the bold certainty of a child who believed the world could still be rearranged. Daniel Reed emerged from the back room with the guarded posture of a man who had learned to expect disappointment, and when his eyes landed on Lydia, confusion hardened into alarm, then something like shame, because he knew who she was without being told, the woman from the station, the one people whispered about. Lydia spoke first, apologizing, offering to leave at once, but Thomas interrupted with fierce loyalty, announcing she was staying for supper, and Daniel's jaw tightened as he looked from his son's hopeful face to Lydia's tired one, and the decision he made then was not warm or welcoming, but it was solid. "You'll eat," he said. "After that, we'll see." The house held the quiet of long grief, everything in its place, but nothing alive in it, and Lydia felt it in the empty hooks on the wall, the absence of small comforts, the way Daniel moved around furniture like he was careful not to disturb memories. She washed her hands at the basin Thomas pointed out, scrubbing away dust and doubt alike, and when she returned to the kitchen, Daniel was battling a pot on the stove with the grim determination of a man who refused to ask for help. Lydia asked softly if she might assist, and after a long pause Daniel stepped back, as if letting her near the stove cost him something pride alone could not explain. She tasted the stew, added salt and herbs hanging and used from the rafters, and watched the food change into something meant to nourish rather than endure. And when Thomas took his first bite, his eyes widened, and he said it tasted like his mother's cooking. The room froze. Daniel turned away too quickly, muttering something about checking the stock, and Lydia understood then that grief did not vanish. It merely waited for moments like this to remind you it was still there. That night, a storm rolled in hard and sudden, rain striking the roof with urgency, and Daniel told Lydia she would stay because it was not safe to leave, and for the first time since arriving in the territory, she did not argue. She slept under a heavy quilt stitched from scraps, waking once to thunder and once to the sound of Thomas breathing steadily in the next room. And in the morning, she rose to find Daniel burning eggs and Thomas correcting him with a seriousness that made Lydia smile, despite herself. She stayed one more day, then another, telling herself it was temporary, that she was only helping until she could decide what came next. But days have a way of turning into patterns when no one stops them. Lydia cleaned corners grief had neglected, mended small things Daniel had learned to step around, and opened ledgers that revealed a farm balancing on the edge of loss. When a neighbor offered to take her back to town, Daniel said flatly that she was helping here, and Lydia added, with a steadiness that surprised them both, that she intended to continue for a while. The real test came when Thomas fell ill, fever burning through his small body and fear burning through his father's restraint. Daniel paced like a man reliving an old nightmare, and Lydia stayed by the bed, cooling Thomas's skin and speaking calm into the dark hours. When Daniel tried to flee the room, Lydia stopped him and told him he could survive this, even if he did not believe it yet. Near dawn, the fever broke, and Daniel sank into a chair with relief written raw across his face. "You stayed," he said simply. "Yes," Lydia answered. And in that moment, the word meant more than she could explain. The trouble everyone in Briar Creek had been waiting for arrived quietly, dressed as paperwork and deadlines. When a hard-eyed man rode out to the Reed place and spoke of unpaid taxes and foreclosure with a smile that never warmed, Daniel stood in the yard afterward like the ground had shifted under his feet, and Lydia understood that this was the moment when kindness alone would not be enough. She worked the way she always had when fear grew too large, methodically, patiently, turning spare goods into something sellable, speaking to neighbors who had watched Daniel struggle in silence for too long, and discovering that people were willing to help once someone finally asked. When a letter arrived from the east bearing a small inheritance, just enough to settle the debt, Daniel assumed it meant her leaving. He told her she should go, start over properly, free of half-built hopes. Lydia surprised him by shaking her head. She said she would stay, not as charity and not as a guest, but as a partner, because this life had grown real in a way promises never had. Daniel took a long time before answering, but when he did, his voice carried truth instead of fear. The man who had lied to Lydia appeared soon after, bold enough to reclaim her once he heard money was involved, and he tried to shame her publicly, to turn her waiting into disgrace. Lydia answered him plainly, choosing honesty over safety, and the town chose with her. Daniel stood beside her without raising his voice, and for the first time, he did not step back into silence. They married simply, with Thomas between them, proud and unafraid, as if he had always known how the story would end. A fire took the barn weeks later, fierce and fast, but the animals were saved and the house remained, and the town came together to rebuild what was lost, board by board, meal by meal, proof that some things grew stronger after burning. On a quiet evening, Lydia stood on the porch watching Thomas chase fireflies in the dark, Daniel's hand warm and steady in hers. She had waited at a station for a promise that never existed, but the wrong train had carried her to the right place, and the choice she made to stop waiting had given her something better than certainty. It had given her a life that stayed.